$318 trillion. That is not a theoretical projection for the distant future. That is not a worst-case scenario modeled by a computer. That is the actual, terrifying amount of debt that exists in the world right now, confirmed by the Institute of International Finance at the end of 2024. But a raw number, no matter how large, doesn't tell the full story. To understand the gravity of the danger, you have to look at the ratio. The entire global economy, every factory, every service, every crop, everything we produce in a single year is only worth about $105 trillion. Do the math. We owe 3 times more than we make. The ledger is broken. And while the world sleepwalks toward the edge of this mathematical cliff, one asset is flashing a warning signal that history tells us we cannot ignore. Silver is sitting at $64.0 an ounce. Why does that specific price matter? Because we have seen this movie before. We have watched this exact sequence play out across every major civilization in human history. Right now, we are living through Act 3 of a 4-act play that always ends the same way. The machine is shaking, the debt is due, and the reset is coming. Welcome to Fiscal Flair. The pattern I am about to show you is simple. In fact, it is almost too simple. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Modern economists and politicians thrive on complexity. They build labyrinthine models and speak in jargon to convince you that the global financial system is a machine too sophisticated to fail. But if you strip away the noise, you realize that every major economic collapse follows the exact same 4-act script. Act 1 begins with truth. A civilization establishes a currency rooted in reality. Gold coins, silver coins, something tangible that you can hold in your hand. This creates trust. Trade flourishes because the money represents actual, stored energy. Act 2 is the betrayal. The government, inevitably, needs more money than it has. Perhaps it is a war or expensive social programs, or simply the desire to remain in power. So, the leadership decides to cheat. They clip the coins, they dilute the gold, they print paper claims that exceed the metal in the vault. They create the illusion of wealth, while the real value remains stagnant. Act 3 is where the consequences arrive. This is the phase where prices climb not because goods are worth more, but because the currency is worth less. The public begins to notice the fraud. Trust fractures. Smart money quietly exits the paper system and flees into anything real: land, commodities, gold, and silver. Act 4 is the death of the currency. It doesn't matter if it takes a decade or a century, the mathematics always assert themselves. The currency collapses, society resets, and a new system is born from the ashes. Here is the brutal reality of Act 4. The people who trusted the paper lose everything. The people who saw the pattern coming and held real assets, they survive. You might think this is alarmist theory. You might think modern America is immune to the laws of history. So, let me prove it to you. Let me show you 3 specific times this mechanism executed with mechanical precision, dismantling empires that look just as invincible as ours does today. To see where we are going, we must first look back to the marble halls of a superpower that thought it would last. To see the blueprint of our own destruction, we must travel back nearly 2,000 years to the cobblestones of ancient Rome. The year is 64 AD. Rome is not just a city, it is the center of the known universe, an unshakable superpower that spans continents. But Emperor Nero has a problem. The Great Fire of Rome has just incinerated 2/3 of his capital. On the borders, he is fighting endless, bleeding wars against Parthia. Internally, the Jewish revolt is draining the treasury dry. The empire is spending money faster than its silver mines can pull metal from the earth. Nero is faced with a choice that every bankrupt leader eventually faces: austerity or fraud. He chooses fraud. For generations, the Roman silver coin, the denarius, had been the standard of the world, minted at 95% pure silver. It was trusted from Britannia to India. But Nero decides to change the recipe. He orders the mint to secretly reduce the silver content to 80%. It is a subtle change. To the average shopkeeper, the coin looks the same. It weighs the same. But Nero has just magically created more money to pay his debts without finding more silver. He thinks he has outsmarted the laws of economics. He has not. He has simply set a precedent that will eventually burn the empire to the ground. Fast forward to 97 AD. The precedent Nero set has become an addiction. Emperor Septimius Severus needs to buy the loyalty of his legions, so he doubles their pay. But he cannot afford it. So he returns to the mint. The silver content of the denarius crashes to 46%. His son, Caracalla, desperate to keep the scheme running, introduces entirely new coins that claim to be worth 2 denarii but contain only a fraction of the silver. By the time Emperor Gallienus takes the throne in the 260s, the mask has fully slipped. The coin that built the world is now composed of just 5% silver. It is a piece of worthless bronze washed in a thin coat of silver paint. Then, the mathematics strike back. The economy collapses. The soldiers, the very men the emperors were trying to bribe, refuse to accept the coins. They demand payment in physical goods because they know the money is a lie. The price of grain triples. The sophisticated trade networks of the empire disintegrate because trust, the currency of commerce, has evaporated. People begin hoarding the old coins, the real silver, while the bad money floods the streets, worthless. By 310 AD, the cycle reaches Act 4. Emperor Constantine is forced to create an entirely new currency just to restore order. The old denarius, once the symbol of Roman power, is declared dust. It takes millions of them to equal a single gold coin. The middle class of Rome is wiped out. This was the greatest civilization on earth. They had the best engineers, the strongest army, and the most advanced laws. And yet, they could not stop the pattern. Now, let's jump forward through the centuries to a nation that had the best scientists and philosophers of the modern age, and watch them make the exact. If Rome was a slow burn that spanned centuries, our next destination proves that the pattern can destroy a nation in a single, terrifying decade. We jump forward to the industrial heart of Europe, Germany, 1914. At the dawn of the 20th century, the German mark was one of the strongest currencies on the planet. It was backed by gold, built on a foundation of world-class engineering, chemistry, and manufacturing. But when the guns of World War I began to fire, the German government made a fatal calculation. They suspended the gold standard. They believed the war would be short, they were certain they would win, and they planned to pay their debts with the plundered wealth of their defeated enemies. They were wrong. Germany lost. And instead of loot, they received a death sentence disguised as a peace treaty. The Treaty of Versailles handed the shattered nation a bill for 122 billion gold marks. In today's money, that is over 500 billion. The annual payments alone consumed 25% of the nation's entire GDP. It was a mathematical impossibility. The new democratic government found itself trapped. They wanted to rebuild the country. They wanted to fund social programs to keep the population happy. But their tax revenue covered only 37% of their spending. They had a choice: default and collapse, or print the difference. So, the Reichsbank turned on the machines. At first, the slide was gradual, a warning tremor before the quake. In early 1922, it took 160 marks to buy a single US dollar. It was painful, but manageable. The currency still functioned. But the debt was a beast that had to be fed. As the government printed more paper to buy foreign currency to pay reparations, the value of the mark began to dissolve. By December of that same year, the exchange rate had collapsed to 7,400 marks to the dollar. A 46-fold devaluation in just 6 months. Then came 1923, the year the math broke reality. When France and Belgium invaded the Ruhr industrial region to seize resources as payment, the German government responded by supporting a general strike. They decided to pay 2 million workers to not work. To fund this madness, the printing presses went into overdrive, running day and night. The numbers that followed defy comprehension. In June 1923, a dollar cost 192,000 marks. By October, it was 170 billion. By November, it hit 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. The currency was no longer money, it was confetti. The scenes on the street were apocalyptic. People pushed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. In cafes, university students would order a cup of coffee, and before they could finish drinking it, the price would increase by 40%. Factory workers demanded to be paid twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, because the wages earned at 9:30 a.m. would be worthless by dinner time. Farmers refused to trade their food for paper, leaving cities to starve. The middle class was annihilated. Families who had saved for decades saw their life's work reduced to zero. And we know the dark conclusion of this story. The desperation and economic trauma of 1923 paved the road for a dictator. The collapse of the currency helped bring Adolf Hitler to power. On November 15, 1923, the cycle ended with Act 4. The government introduced the Rentenmark. They reset the system. 1 trillion old marks were exchanged for 1 new Rentenmark. The savings of an entire generation were officially declared dead. The pattern had executed again. Rome fell in centuries. Weimar Germany fell in years. But surely the United States, the architect of the modern financial world, is smarter than this. Surely we have learned from history. You are about to see that we haven't learned a thing. We just built a... This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the empire we are living in today. The date is August 15th, 1971. It is a quiet Sunday evening, but inside the White House, the air is thick with panic. President Richard Nixon interrupts television broadcasts across the nation to announce a decision that will fundamentally rewrite the genetic code of the global economy. He tells the American people that he is closing the gold window. For 27 years, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US dollar had been the bedrock of the world because it was anchored to reality, fixed at 35 per ounce of gold. Foreign governments held dollars because they were as good as the metal itself. But Washington had broken the rules. To fund the Vietnam War and the Great Society social programs, they had printed far more paper receipts than they had gold in the vaults. The world called their bluff. Nixon promised the measure was temporary. He promised it would stabilize the dollar. He lied. The window never reopened. In that moment, the restraints were cut. The dollar ceased to be a store of value and became a political weapon. What followed was immediate chaos. During the 1970s, the dollar collapsed against real assets. Gold did not just rise, it exploded, rocketing from 35 an ounce to 850 by 1980. That wasn't gold becoming 24 times more valuable. That was the dollar losing 24 times its purchasing power. But unlike Rome or Weimar, the printing didn't stop. It accelerated. Fast forward to the modern era. In the financial crisis of 2008, we printed trillions to save the banks. In 2020, during the COVID response, we printed $6 trillion in just 18 months. The machine is now running at a speed that defies logic. Today, the United States national debt stands at $36.1 trillion. But the debt isn't the scariest number on the scoreboard, it's the cost of carrying it. We are now paying $892 billion a year just in interest payments. Let that sink in. The United States government now spends more on servicing its credit card bill than it spends on the entire U.S. military. We are spending more on the ghosts of past spending than we are on the defense of the future. And look at what this has done to the social fabric. Before 1971, when American productivity went up, workers' wages went up with it. Since 1971, productivity has continued to climb, but real wages have flatlined. The wealth gap has exploded. In 1971, a median income earner could buy a house with 2.5 years of salary. Today, it takes over 7 years. Food costs more. Energy costs more. Healthcare costs more. The middle class is being suffocated, not by corporate greed or bad luck, but by the mathematical debasement of the currency they work for. We are in late Act 3. The world knows it. Central banks are diversifying. BRICS nations are openly discussing alternatives. China and Russia are hoarding gold at record rates. The pillars of the US dollar are cracking. So, if the paper is burning, where do you go? History offers one specific answer. An asset that is currently flashing the biggest buy signal in. So, where does silver fit into this timeline of destruction? Throughout every currency collapse in recorded history, from the fires of Rome to the hyperinflation of Weimar, when the paper burns, people do not flee to stocks. They do not flee to bonds. They flee to real assets. Gold and silver have served as money for 5,000 years not because of tradition, but because of physics. They cannot be printed. They cannot be debased by a desperate emperor. They cannot be created by a keystroke at the Federal Reserve. And right now, the mathematics of the silver market are screaming at anyone willing to listen. Let's look at the ratio. Gold is currently trading around 4,230 per ounce. Silver is sitting at 64. That gives us a gold to silver ratio of about 67 to 1. Historically, that number is an anomaly. For centuries, the ratio averaged between 15 to 1 and 50 to 1. During currency crises, when panic sets in, that gap tightens dramatically. If the ratio simply reverted to its historical average of 50 to 1, with gold prices staying exactly where they are, silver would instantly reprice to 85 per ounce. That is a massive jump just to hit the average. But we are not heading for an average event. We are heading for a reset. If you adjust for inflation, the numbers become even more staggering. The all-time high for silver in 1980, adjusted for today's inflated dollars, would put the price at 94 per ounce. Even the 2011 high adjusts to 70. Yet, here we are, trading at 64. The metal that has been the life raft for civilizations for millennia is priced as if nothing is wrong. The market is acting as if this 318 trillion debt mountain can be managed, as if this time is different. They always say that. They said this time is different in Rome when it ruled the known world. They said it in 1920s Germany, one of the most intellectually advanced societies on earth. They trusted their institutions right up until the moment the currency went to zero. The machine does not care about American exceptionalism. It does not care about modern monetary theory. You cannot sustain 318 trillion in debt against 105 trillion in output. You cannot debase a currency indefinitely without consequence. These are not opinions, they are mathematical realities. The laws of economics are as immutable as the laws of physics. You can ignore them for a while, but you cannot break them. Silver isn't just a trade. It isn't just an investment. It is insurance. It is a hedge against the mathematical certainty that this current debt structure cannot continue. It is a bet that history does not stop being history just because we have iPhones and artificial intelligence. At 64 an ounce, with the printing presses running hot and the global debt spiral accelerating, the risk-to-reward equation is staggering. The pattern has executed for 3,000 years. It worked in Act 1. It worked in Act 2. We are watching Act 3 close before our eyes. The machine is running. The only question remaining is whether you will be holding the paper when Act 4 begins, or if you want to know what is truly happening to the dollar, do not listen to what central bankers say. Watch what they do. There is a terrifying hypocrisy at the heart of the modern financial system. Publicly, Federal Reserve officials and economists will tell you that gold and silver are barbarous relics. They will tell you that they are outdated traditions with no place in a modern digital economy. They will assure you that the dollar is strong, stable, and eternal. But while they are reading that script to the public, they are quietly, frantically buying every bar of physical metal they can get their hands on. Look at the data from the last 24 months. Central banks around the world have been buying gold at the fastest pace since 1967. Why? Why would the most sophisticated financial institutions on earth be hoarding a barbarous relic? Because they know the truth. They know the debt numbers we just discussed. The 318 trillion are unpayable. They know the system is nearing its mathematical expiration date. They are hedging their own bets while telling you to keep your savings in paper. And it is not just the banks. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting. For 50 years, the global demand for US dollars was guaranteed because of the petrodollar system. If you wanted to buy oil anywhere on earth, you had to pay in American currency. That demand kept the dollar artificially strong. That era is over. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their new allies are openly building a parallel economy. They are settling trade in their own currencies. They are aggressively bypassing the dollar. Saudi Arabia is now accepting Chinese yuan for oil. The global bid for U.S. debt is evaporating just as the U.S. government needs to borrow more than ever before. This is the classic late-stage symptom of Act 3. The dominant empire loses its privilege. The world stops trusting the reserve currency. The flood of dollars that we exported to the rest of the world for decades is about to come washing back onto American shores. And when those trillions of dollars come home, the inflation we have seen so far will look like a mild breeze compared to the hurricane. So, if the signs are so obvious, if the debt is confirmed, the history is clear, and the central banks are quietly exiting the system, why isn't everyone panicking? Why is the stock market at all-time highs? Why are your neighbors still acting like everything is fine? The answer lies in a dangerous psychological phenomenon known as normalcy bias. The human brain is hardwired to believe that tomorrow will look exactly like today. We assume that because the dollar bought a loaf of bread yesterday, and it bought a loaf of bread this morning, it will buy a loaf of bread forever. We mistake habit for safety. In 1913 Germany, the middle class sat in cafes, discussed philosophy, and believed their currency was rock solid. They looked at the cracks in the economy and dismissed them. They thought, we are a civilized nation. Things like total collapse don't happen to us. They were suffering from the illusion of permanence. The most dangerous phase of any crisis is the moment right before the break. It is the moment when the system looks normal on the surface, but the structural integrity underneath has completely rotted away. Ernest Hemingway once wrote about how bankruptcy happens two ways: gradually, then suddenly. We have been living through the gradually phase for 50 years. We have watched prices creep up. We have watched savings erode. We have watched the debt mountain grow. We have normalized the abnormal, but we are fast approaching the suddenly. When Act 4 arrives, it does not send an invitation. It does not give you a 2-week warning to convert your cash into silver. It happens overnight. One day, the bank holiday is announced. One day, the currency devalues. One day, the shelves are empty. The herd will be paralyzed. They will wait for the government to save them. They will wait for the television to tell them what to do. But by the time they react, the transfer will be over. The window to move from paper to metal will be welded shut. You are watching this video because you suspect the suddenly is coming. You are fighting that normalcy bias. And that instinct, that quiet voice telling you that the math doesn't add up, is the only thing that separates the victims from the machine is running, the gears are grinding, the warning lights that began flickering in ancient Rome are now burning with a steady, blinding intensity in Washington. We have traced the arc of history. We have seen the math. The 308 trillion debt is not just a number on a screen, it is a countdown. The pattern is executing with the cold, unyielding precision of gravity. Act 1 is a memory. Act 2 is the foundation of our current illusion. Act 3 is crumbling beneath our feet right now. But knowing the history is only half the battle. The most dangerous thing you can possess in a dying economy is foresight without action. Do not buy silver because you think the world is ending. The world will keep turning. Buy it because the mathematics of the current world cannot continue. Buy it because when the debt eventually breaks the back of the dollar, wealth will not disappear. It will simply transfer. It will flow from those holding paper promises to those holding physical reality. You now have the map. You see the cliff that the herd is sprinting toward. The machine does not care if you believe in it. It does not care about your politics or your optimism. It only executes. And Act 4 is not a probability. It is a certainty. The only question left for you to answer is simple. When the dust settles on the greatest wealth transfer in human history, will you be the victim who waited too long or the beneficiary who prepared in time? If this gave you a new perspective,